All right. Should be live right now. Getting back to doing research on Genesis. And I at least one video, maybe two already saved, kind of lined up for us to take a look at. Give me one schmecken. All right. Looks like we're good. In this front. Just give me one more second. All right. Let's get to it then. Let's see, I think it was Inspiring Philosophy. One of his videos he did. Yeah, this one. Torah's True Age Older Than You Think. It's been interesting. Last time I kind of bounced back and forth between useful charts and inspiring philosophy. And then off stream, I watched, what is it called? It's like decoding. Hold on. Pull it up here. What was it? I watched Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus. And that was fascinating because it kind of showed that if you line up the chronology in a specific way, it does show evidence for the Israelites, or at least Semitic people in Egypt prospering, a Semitic people in Egypt prospering, and then abruptly leaving. And there are some other stuff that went along with it that I found fascinating. You know, it's sort of like if you're not finding evidence at a certain time frame, then maybe you're in the wrong time frame. And that makes sense to me. You know, we're still nothing is sort of, especially when it comes to archaeology, nothing is completely set in stone. I think there's just different levels of confidence that we have in all of that, in any given thing when it comes to archaeology, especially when you get into 3,000 years old, 4,000 years old, so on and so forth. The further you go back, the less confidence we have in the dates that we ascribe to it and what took place and what have you. Also, the further you go back, the less actual writing there actually is. At some point, there's just no writing, or the writing that does exist at a certain point, the further you go back, is writing that we don't understand anymore. Which obviously makes things tricky without written documentation of certain things. It's kind of left up to, we gather the evidence and we try to make sense of it using many, many different techniques. I don't know, maybe in a in a different life, I feel like I would have enjoyed being an archaeologist. I find the practice and very interesting. All right, let's get to this.
But other prophets, Jewish and Christian traditions ascribe the first 5 books of the Bible to Moses, a prophet of God who led the Hebrews out of Egypt in the 13th century BC.
All right, one moment. I'm just gonna write down what we're watching in case, you know, for note-taking's sake. But yeah, it's interesting going back and forth between useful charts and inspiring philosophy because one is very um clearly inspiring philosophy desires to give the best sort of evidence possible to show proof and evidence that the Bible is more historically accurate than maybe the average person in this field would come to. Um, Obviously, the average person, what is the average person? And you got billions of people on the planet, but as far as Christians are concerned, the average Christian would definitely be more in line to agree with inspiring philosophy for the most part, um, compared to the average agnostic or atheist, or even the average person of a faith that isn't an Abrahamic faith. So if you're not of the Abrahamic faith, you're probably more going to lean towards what Useful Charts has to say. And I do feel like Useful Charts is more of the what would be considered like mainstream scientific thought, or yeah, mainstream historical perspective. So it is interesting to sort of go back and forth between the two.
But many scholars have rejected this tradition and even doubt if Moses ever existed. Instead, the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch as it's more properly called, must have been written much later and were originally separate sources. They were then compiled at a later point and attributed to a mythical figure called Moses. Allegedly, we are told all the evidence shows the Pentateuch is a late document and could not possibly date back to the time of Moses. But within the scholarly world, some interesting evidence has come forward. Several aspects of the Pentateuch suggest very ancient traditions that could not have developed during later periods of Israel's history. And when we combine all this data, back to the time of Moses.
Hold on, I wanted to hear that one more time.
But within the scholarly world, some interesting evidence has come forward. Several aspects of the Pentateuch suggest very ancient traditions that could not have developed during later periods of Israel's history.
So I feel like that's kind of sort of understood and agreed upon that the whole point of Genesis, Exodus, it's all talking about what took place many, many years ago before it got written down. Even if, let's just go with Moses, if Moses had written, at least Genesis and Exodus, that all took place substantially many years before he was born. So, I believe whoever wrote down the Torah it's clear that they're talking about the past. I don't know. There's some interesting wording here that I'm like, he's like, it couldn't have developed. I hate to say it, but it does feel a bit straw, almost a little straw man to me in the setup in this video. But let's keep going.
And when we combine all this data, we come away with a powerful cumulative case that the Pentateuch is very ancient, and much of it could date to the very time of Moses.
Pentateuch is ancient. Is he talking about this is where for our purposes, we're looking at Genesis right now. Obviously, this will definitely have a bit more weight to it when we get to Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. So a little bit of this is because I do believe certain events, obviously in the Torah, in the first 5 books, take place during Moses being alive. Hold on. When did Moses die? He couldn't have written books if it was after his death. You know, that seems kind of absurd, right? Well, oh. Just quickly looking through the old Bible. Right, Ten Commandments. Okay. Oh goodness, Leviticus. Laws on laws on laws. It's going to be interesting to go through. Okay, we're into Numbers, Sons of Aaron. Alright. When in the Bible does Moses pass away? Still in Numbers. Okay. Pose Moses, center of office. Still alive, still alive. Joshua to succeed Moses. We're in Numbers. Right. Okay, where? All right, all right. Still around in Deuteronomy. Again, we're getting way ahead of for my purposes here, but I'm curious. Passover. Okay. Oh, goodness. I might have missed it already. Hold on. Nope, Moses still around. Deuteronomy 27. Joshua to succeed Moses. Didn't I have something around up earlier? Here we go. Death of Moses. Chapter 34, Deuteronomy. Okay, and then we start Joshua, which is not a part of yeah. Okay, interesting. So the last chapter of the Torah, the Pentateuch, what have you, is the death of Moses. Hence why it is feasible. Obviously, you probably wouldn't have written chapter 34, but they're looking at this as like, but they hadn't. Hold on. By this point, they hadn't conquered. Yeah, Moses never sees the promised land. If I remember correctly, which I believe I do. Okay. It's not crazy if for the idea of Moses was contracting other people to write down, such as like the laws and stuff. It's not crazy. You know, it's the issue of evidence and proof that is, you know, how do we prove that today? It's not crazy for them to be much more easy to keep law, like, you know, all these laws in Leviticus and stuff, and all the laws in Numbers, like don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, do this, do this, don't do that. It's a lot easier to keep track of that if you're writing that down. Which it would be more reasonable if they are going through the wilderness. I know we haven't gotten there yet in the story, but if they're in the wilderness, you probably want to write things on, you know, papyrus or paper, because it's lighter in weight than carrying around a bunch of tablets that'll weigh you down while you're traveling. And paper does not last nearly as long as tablets, let me tell you. Then it's also like, Also, it's not completely unfeasible for them to just like have somebody memorize this and have certain people be in charge of memorizing these things. You know, Lord knows I wouldn't be up for the task. My memory is crap. But in theory, you could have somebody memorizing this stuff. Just think of how many times you have to tell it to them. And you yourself would have to remember, you know. But if you're the one kind of like coming up with this stuff, you know, we're relaying the information. I mean, clearly a lot of this is Moses claiming that God spoke to him and he's merely relaying the information from God. From what I can see, you know. All right. But yeah, I mean, it would be a lot more reasonable for them to write this stuff down if they had the means at their disposal. So it could be, you know, again, was it written by Moses? Could have been, or it could have been him orally composing and everybody and people writing it down, you know, I mean, as he's composing. It's like whether he himself wrote it down or not, it does it. A lot of these chapters start with, and the Lord said to Moses, and the Lord spoke to Moses, and the Lord spoke to Moses, and the Lord spoke to Moses. So it's sort of like if he's not the author, he's kind of the orator of it for the most part. This all just quotes verse after verse, just quoting, quoting, quoting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They forgot a quotation mark right there. Maybe that's to say it keeps going. What's interesting is they'll do like it's like they do a quotation at the beginning, but then they don't put a quotation at the end, but then at the start of the next verse, the quotation mark appears again. I don't know if this is some kind of like something that English does that I don't fully. I guess it's to show that what's on it. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just him at least orating a lot of this. All right, well, hey, Exodus is the next book we're gonna cover. So you know, we'll get to that when we get to that. All right.
Theories of how the Pentateuch came to its final form are a dime a dozen. There are various documentary, fragmentary, and supplementary hypotheses. Some of them combine elements from these three categories, and also various redactional stages have been proposed. But most posit that the earliest sections of the Pentateuch were not written until long after the time of Moses, and then it did not reach its final form until centuries later. Many scholars suggest that there were early texts written in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. At later points, like during the Babylonian exile or after, these texts were edited and then combined to fit together into a single cohesive narrative. Thus, there's no reason to think any figure named Moses had anything to do with the Pentateuch. It came about from a long process that started after he was said to exist. However, there is important evidence that suggests the Pentateuch is much older than you think. First, Geoffrey Morrow and John Bergsma point to other books of the Hebrew Bible that quote or refer to sayings from the Torah, which shows us the sayings already existed in some form. Julius Wellhausen once proposed the Holiness Code, found in Leviticus 17-26, was created late and utilized Ezekiel 40 to 48. But Benjamin Kilker points out very few scholars still hold to this today. Instead, Reza Levet Cohen demonstrated that Ezekiel was utilizing Deuteronomy in the Holiness Code of Leviticus. This can be seen in how Ezekiel conflates passages from both sections. Essentially, instead of two different and later authors utilizing Ezekiel to create the Holiness Code in Deuteronomy, it is a much simpler explanation to posit that Ezekiel utilized the two works and wove them together. Michael Loynes came to a similar conclusion. Wherever the direction of dependence could be demonstrated, it went from the Pentateuch to Ezekiel. As David Carr said, one prominent mark of relative lateness across all four of the texts studied here was the tendency to conflate materials found in the disparate parts of the Pentateuch into one location. The only linguistic phenomenon that did seem to make sense as the basis for a criterion is the variation of the criterion of conflation. The text tends to be later than its parallels, when it combines linguistic phenomena from the disparate strata of the Pentateuch. Morrow and Bergsma document several examples of how Ezekiel utilized the Pentateuch from Exodus to
Let's see here. Sources, you should not profane my holy name. You, oh husband, go and serve every one of you his idols. If you will not listen to me, but my holy name you shall no more profane with your gifts and your idols. Okay. No. I guess I can read this out loud for the people in the back. All right, so Pentateuch is like, you shall not profane my holy name. Then Ezekiel, as for you, O house of Israel, go serve every one of you his idols. Which is an interesting, if you will not listen to me. But my holy name you shall no more profane with your gifts and your idols. Interesting. Okay. Deuteronomy 12, verse 5 through 6. But you shall seek the place which the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contributions of your hand, your votive offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstlings. The firstlings. Quirky word. All right, Ezekiel 40. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 40. For on my holy mountain, the mountain height of Israel, says the Lord God, they're all the house of Israel, all of them shall serve me in the land. There I accept them, and there I will seek your contributions and the choicest of your gifts with all of your sacred offerings. You know, this doesn't necessarily need to even rely on the Pentateuch. These could be independent of each other. I mean, God is leading Ezekiel to kind of reiterate what has already been stated, but that doesn't mean that Ezekiel's like reading Deuteronomy and going, ah, yes, now is the time that I must restate chapter 12, verses 5 through 6, because he like read it and he's like, ah, this is a good time. Maybe that's how it, but God could be like, yo. And then he was like, this was what was stated in Deuteronomy. Like Ezekiel probably knew what was stated. Even if this was the Pentateuch hadn't been written down, these are probably verbal traditions passed down of what took place, and it's like, this makes sense. But again, the idea of kind of God reiterating throughout generations a similar message over and over again at specific times, it's not like I don't see anything particularly wrong or like, oh, that's strange. God reiterating a specific message. It's like God does that quite a bit, actually, just in general. It takes humanity a while to incorporate certain foundational teachings. Sometimes a specific generation needs a reminder, you know. I will not smell your pleasing odor. Leviticus 26:31. Okay, then Deuteronomy 30, 30 verse 3. He will gather you from all the peoples where the Lord your God scattered you there. Numbers 20, chapter 20, verse 12. To sanctify me in the eyes of the people of Israel. Leviticus 26, verse 45. I brought them forth from the land of Egypt in the eyes of the nations. And then Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 41. As a pleasing odor I will accept you, when I bring you out from the peoples and gather you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will sanctify myself among you in the eyes of the nations. I don't using I don't even know if he's plagiarizing or not plagiarizing, that's a terrible word. Drawing inspiration from using the concept of a pleasing odor. Again, he might know all of this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's using that because, this is a perfect moment for Leviticus 26:31. And then after that, like, if he's hearing this from God, it might sound familiar to him, and it might like connect in his mind of different things in different sections of earlier. But it's very much about, yeah, the moment that he is speaking forth. It's interesting that this is sort of like, have people used like this in Ezekiel? Is he saying people have used this in Ezekiel to basically claim that like this, basically Ezekiel is the one that inspired Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers in this way? Like, see, Ezekiel inspired these passages. Then they just it would feel more like inspiration if it wasn't piecemealed. Like the fact that it's sort of piecemealed on Ezekiel's end feels more like Ezekiel's the one being more in the inspired camp. Because generally people don't slice up one. I will not smell, like, look at this. This is like, it's all over the place. To say that this was somehow like, because, sorry, you can't see my mouse. I'm like circling things and I forget that y'all can't see my mouse. To say that Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 41, the bottom section on the right, or the mid-bottom section on the right, inspired this sort of piecemealing, like, this doesn't make any sense to me. It's very strange. All right, let's keep going.
Deuteronomy. They also highlight that Ezekiel stressed the importance of Zion theology, which is the view that God promised an everlasting covenant with King David and his descendants, and that their royal line would last forever, and that the capital would be at Jerusalem. This was incredibly important to the Jews after the period of King David. So we should ask, if Ezekiel was a source for the Pentateuch, why would its authors utilize Ezekiel but remove any mention of Jerusalem or Zion? It seems far more likely that Ezekiel was utilizing the Pentateuch and combining it with Zion theology.
I mean, again, inspired by, but also, I don't, look, we are way ahead of Genesis at this point. I don't know how helpful this is going to be in general to what I'm trying to do with Genesis. That's where some of these videos, like, I might just have to shelve this and save it for a later date. I mean, yeah, this is a 48-minute video. I have no idea what throughout this video is going to apply to what my purposes. Okay.
In the treaties of how Nickmadu II of Ugarit became a vassal of Hatti. In the first treaty, the enemies of Ugarit assembled troops to attack their territory. Nickmadu II asked for aid from the Hittites, and they came and delivered Ugarit. But in the second text, the enemies attempt to pressure Nickmadu II into joining with them against the Hittites. There was no invasion of Ugarit's territory. These documents were found in the same room in the southern palace at Ugarit and date to the same time period. It is unlikely they were competing traditions from later periods. They were both sent by the king of Hatti to the king of Ugarit, even though they contradict. A similar issue is found in the treaties that recount how Amaru became a vassal of Hatti. In the earlier treaty, it did come in at a later point.
Okay, well, what are we doing here? Yeah, I might. Either I'm gonna watch this thing in its entirety, or we're gonna wait on it. Screw it. Let's go with it.
Is generally divided into two, and combining it with Zion theology. This is an important point that we will come back to. But other prophets also seem to be aware of and utilize the Pentateuch. Jeremiah was also drawing from the 5 books of Moses, as well as other books found in the Hebrew Bible. The book of Isaiah is generally divided into 2 authors, one being early and one being 2nd Isaiah, who wrote later. There is no question that 2nd Isaiah draws from the Pentateuch. Mauro and Bergsma note more scholarship should be done on the topic of 1st Isaiah, but we do see evidence Isaiah utilized the Pentateuch. Key passages of the first part of Isaiah, such as Isaiah 11, clearly draw on Zion theology, Edenic creation imagery, and Exodus traditions. However, work remains to be done to determine if such allusions are to specific texts or simply to commonly known traditions.
I mean, yeah, it's hard for me to say. I haven't done any research on. We are so far ahead of Genesis. Look, it's been probably for me specifically about 10 years since I've really read the Bible in any sort of like in-depth way. I've looked at past 10 years. There are moments where I'll kind of like just sort of dabble here and there. Um, but not in like a really like trying to really connect the dots like I'm attempting to do right now. So again, it seems a little unfortunately over my head because how am when was Isaiah, yeah, this we're gonna have to save this for another time because I just feel like I'm not gonna get a lot out of this 48 minutes. All right, let's reconsider the lesson plan for today. All right. thinking about actually going through Genesis and from here compiling um everything that God said and looking at and all like basically what he said, the actions that he took um in the Bible and just sort of kind of isolating those on their own. I was like, all right, what did God specifically do and say? And is there any like conclusions that we can kind of draw from this? Or commentary that I can bring to this that I might think is meaningful. Um let's do this. Let's do I think we need to be more specific rather than Genesis because it seems like that book gets kind of wrapped up in the Torah and the Pentateuch uh quite often. Quite often. All right. Um let's go with this. This could be interesting. Um what is worth our time? Was worth my time in this, you know. Um, Exploring Genesis. Look at this. It's doing a similar kind of thing. Genesis 2 and 3. Human evolution. You know, why not? Let's give him a shot. It is a long video, but um, hold on. It's not the world as God made it. Oh, evolution. Hmm. DNA. I think that there is. Okay. Well, you gotta think, even from like an evolutionary standpoint, there's a point where, you know, that's the thing. I feel like, how do I put this? It's obviously a point even in the document. Like, I think the other day I looked up oldest known remains of Homo sapiens, and they're like from 300,000 years ago in Morocco. It's like, all right, interesting, you know? But what, I don't know if they've done, I mean, I think they've done some DNA studies, obviously, but like, what are the DNA markers that separate all the different, like, homogeneuses from each other? You know, because obviously if they're forming different, shaped skulls, this, that, and the other, how much body hair they have, and da 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 da, all that snazzy jazz. It's all linked to genetics. So, you know, it's interesting how different creatures kind of like have different sort of different animals have different flexibility, such as a wolf can still wolves and dogs are still so close to each other despite many different sort of uh, physical appearances and even temperaments um, and what have you, or and also like many size differences. Yet they can still have babies and still have babies with each other. Well, I wonder. The classic is like a pug looking at a wolf. It's like, what the heck? These two, as far as physical appearances go, they look quite, you know, quite different from each other. As far as just the pug with its swish, like that's a wolf, or that's came from a wolf. Okay, they got, fur and ears and legs and eyes, blah, 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 yeah. They have more similarities than they have differences, especially comparing like a wolf to a jellyfish, you know what I mean? So, but I wonder what would happen if you made a wolf pug hybrid. Can they even do that? I mean, obviously, the physical aspect of it would probably be maybe impossible. But if you just like, gathered up the sperm and put it into the egg, and then you had, oh goodness, you'd have to put that into the wolf, a female wolf, because I don't know, maybe the growth of those babies would be a problem. I don't know. I'm not educated enough, but I am curious if they can still produce puppies, and what would that look like? Because normally when I hear of like wolf hybrids, they're like hybrids with huskies, you know. I mean, can you have a wolf Pomeranian? I don't know. I don't know. Like, is there a point where a wolf and despite the maybe the physical difficulties of copulation, if you just took the sperm and the egg, would it actually function and make babies? I'm curious. Not the point of this stream, and not the point of this uh, what I'm doing here. Just a little tangent. Um, where do you begin? That's where it's like, okay, I plug it in. Whose video is worth even looking at here? Let's check this guy out, because it seems like he's at least, exploring Genesis. That's similar to what I'm doing essentially.
Critics of Christianity often claim that modern science debunks the Bible's account of human origins in Genesis 2 and 3 in this famous story of Adam and Eve. Jerry Coyne is an example of this. He talks about the clear results of populations genetics that Adam and Eve could not have existed. He uses this issue to proclaim the victory of science over religion.
There's also the other thing that I wanted to look at was the age of people. Because I think it's in maybe Sumerian tradition that people lived much longer back in the day. But I think that was like attributed to like, yeah, maybe it was attributed to gods or demigod, like they were demigods and that's why they lived so long. Something to that effect.
He references the real difference between science and religion. Science discards ideas when they fall to pieces. Faith tries to cobble them together into something that still convinces gullible believers.
Okay, I think that religion is slowly giving way in this, but in general, I do agree with that statement. Not even just convinces, convince, I think that's just taking a shot right there, using some, you could get rid of gullible and you could just say convinces believers, But yes, convinces gullible believers as well. But I feel like that's kind of like a way to poke at oh, if you're a believer that it's a way to kind of form a wedge. It's a wedge forming statement. You know what I mean? Which, hey, you do you, boo. That's what you want to do. Let's see. Science discards ideas when they fall to pieces, as you should. And yeah, I do find that religion does attempt to use faith as sort of like a glue um, to piece things together, even in the face of um, overwhelming evidence sometimes.
I won't give other examples of this way of thinking. I learned when I cited Bill Maher in my videos on the flood. Don't don't trigger people, but you're familiar with this. Most of the people who watch my videos from one side or the other are aware of and familiar with kind of the science versus faith kind of issues. So you're aware, you've heard this kind of thing before. In this video, I want to respond to those claims, and I want to argue that the biblical account of humanity has not been falsified in the modern world. On the contrary, it's a gift to the modern world. It's what the modern world is searching for. The story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2-3 is like food for the hungry. It offers us this foundation for what we all long for, namely the true story that explains who we are and what is significant about human beings. And it's a story that we keep.
Just because it fills a void does not mean it belongs there. That's what I'll say. You know, it's like, yes, it does fill a certain void. If you don't, it's neat. And I think people like the fact that it's neat. It's less, it's far more simple than what science has the conclusions that science has come to about when the earth was created, when the universe has been created, evolution, this, that, and the other. The story of Adam and Eve is far more simple and easier to digest. And also it includes things like God and this mighty power, this creator, and you know, so it's far more, feels more meaningful than the Big Bang, dust collecting into a star, and then like planets form and then, you know, we're just evolved creatures from other creatures that, you know, it feels very, from a scientific perspective, it feels far less impersonal. And that's not saying that's a good or a bad thing. That's just the reality of it. Not saying science is failing because it's because clearly it's wrong because it's impersonal. It just, well, and just because the creation story feels more personal to like God and what have you does not make it correct either. Again, let's keep going.
Can't find elsewhere fully. So it's unique as well. At the same time, this is a difficult passage of scripture. It needs to be interpreted carefully. A lot of Christians assume the most literalistic way of reading it. I'm going to push back against that as well. And so this will be kind of a controversial video. I'm aware of that. I've counted the cost. I've already been through this. I've kind of made a resolution just to never shy away from talking about something if it's in line with the goal of my ministry, which is Truth Unites exists to cause gospel assurance to through theological depth. And this is an issue that causes a lack of assurance. It causes deep anxieties. And I think when we shy away from something just because it's controversial, that sets people up for failure, and it contributes to that anxiety, and it contributes to the struggles. You know, we've just got to find a way in the body of Christ to talk about these things, and in a spirit of sincere openness before the text of Scripture, working through it, and so forth. So I'm going to try to do this. I hope this will be helpful for people in this video. I'm aware these are challenging things to talk about. I want to give my life to help people and to serve the cause of truth. So I've kind of just said, you know, come what may. I mean, if nothing else, even if my videos make you angry, at least know they're coming from a heart that is sincerely committed to trying to help advance what I believe is true. So now at the same time, the goal of this video is not actually to arrive upon a conclusion in terms of one specific option for how to put things together. Rather, what I'm going to try to do is bring conceptual clarity about the various options that are on the table for Christians. I want to increase awareness and engagement in this important area. And then I want to encourage a certain disposition toward the question that I'm going to describe as a groundedness on the central issues, but more humility and open-handedness on some of the peripheral issues that come up. If this video is successful, it will accomplish three things. Number one, it will provide some answers to secular critiques. Number two, it will inculcate patience within the body of Christ when we talk about these things and when we work through our differences. And number three, it will reduce anxiety along the way for struggling Christians who are wrestling with this. And there's a lot of people right now, especially our precious young people in the church.
All right, I'm going to write this one down. I do appreciate his approach, and also he's doing a good job structuring. Like, here's what I'm trying to do. Da 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 da. This is sort of like, I do very much appreciate his approach, and he seems very level-headed in this.
There are three sections. First, I want to argue that it's important for Christians to maintain and to uphold a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall. And I'll define that tricky word historical when I get there. Second,
Yeah, that's important. Historical. It's like, are you saying factual? Or are you saying it is historical in the sense that it is something that people have used for thousands of years as that has influenced millions and billions of people in their search of the truth, their faith in God, and their sort of viewpoint on God's relationship with humanity. From a historical perspective, it is extremely important because it has been treated in such a way as fact that it has made such a huge and vast impact on billions of people. So, historically speaking, it's very important. However, factually speaking, did it happen?
I want to
Is it true?
encourage patience concerning efforts to harmonize a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall with contemporary scientific claims. And then third, I want to give a description or taxonomy of possible models for what that harmonization process could look like. So first, I want to make a case for a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall. I'm aware that every single thing I argue in this video is going to get pressure from one side or another. So I can understand this is
He's walking that tightrope. I understand.
going to sound crazy to some people, more secular people. But let me explain. So the adjective historical is kind of ambiguous here. There's a couple of distinct questions we want to disambiguate and kind of uncluster. First question is just, are Adam and Eve real people in the past? Second, were Adam and Eve fresh de novo creations? That is, from scratch. Or were they descended from previous hominins? I'll define that word in a second. Third is, were Adam and Eve the first human beings? That's a slightly different question than the second question. And then another fourth question is, were Adam and Eve the biological progenitors of all living human beings? And that is also a separate question from the third question, because as we'll get into, this gets there's actually a number of different options that Christians have advocated for that we'll have to work through here. Now, most of my work previously in the doctrine of creation is on Genesis 1 and the creation of the world. Here I'm moving on to Genesis 2 to 3, the creation of humanity. And for a lot of Christians, rightly so, I think, this is where the deeper worries and anxieties and challenges lie. There are a lot of Christians who are willing to say Genesis 1 is kind of an agree to disagree issue, even animal death before the fall. You can kind of see that both ways. You see all these quotes in the church fathers where they're saying, oh, animal death is fine. So a lot of people are more circumspect about those questions. But when we get to Genesis 2 to 3, the alarm bells start going off more and we start to worry more. And I think that's a good instinct. I think this is more important. The concerns here come into the deepest questions.
Why does that sound on my end of things? What is that? Sorry, y'all. I'm checking my audio. Well, let's keep rolling.
About who we are, what is our need for the gospel, what does it mean to be human, how did the fall happen? There's so many important kind of foundational issues here that seem to go further in their theological consequence than just how old is the world and when did animal death come in. So I'm just saying, I think it's right to feel, and believe me, I've been wrestling with this for about 22 years now. And I feel the anxiety. I get that. I understand that. I felt that at times in my own life. What people like Jerry Coyne and others are saying is a challenge. And it comes at two levels. First, for a while now, there's been the challenge from what we call paleoanthropology, which is basically the study of early humanity. So you think of anthropology as the study of humanity, paleoanthropology, meaning the study of ancient humanity or early old humanity. And basically, what we're talking about here is fossils, archaeological artifacts like tools that we discover and so forth. And we're talking about especially hominin fossils. Hominin, so the word hominin.
Yeah, pause right there. I'm going to take a cigarette break and we'll get back to this. Also, I have ordered a new headset. It's going to be Bluetooth connected. That way, like, for whatever reason, OBS just does not want to register the mic on this for whatever reason. Hence why it is using my webcam. But soon, hopefully tomorrow, that headset will come in and we'll have better audio going forward that will block out the sound of vehicles passing by my house. All right, cigarette break, then we'll continue. This seems like a good video to watch for our purposes. All right. Let's roll.
Usually now is taken to refer to all modern and extinct humans and their immediate ancestors. And then the word hominid with a D is a broader term referring to all modern and extinct great apes. So that's how I'm just going to use the term hominin when we're talking about these other species like Neanderthals and Denisovans and so forth. And even those words, I know I pronounce them probably wrong. I hear other people do it different. Anyway, I know even saying those words causes some people out there different reactions. All I can tell you is with a pastoral heart, I'm going to try to just work through this. So, and also the terminology about hominin versus hominid, that's not always consistent. You can see a little variation there. But bottom line is, we've always had, for a while now, we know we have these hominin fossils. Okay. We've got to try to find some way to interpret that. But this whole area has kind of ratcheted up another level in terms of the challenge here because of the extra layer now that comes on from genetic science. So the claim on the table, okay, is that the human population never went through a bottleneck of fewer than about 10,000 people, much less 2 people, and that's pretty certain. That's put forward as like, we know that for sure. So you've got the paleoanthropological data that's already creating some angst, and then the genetic data comes in as like a 1-2 punch, and it's causing a lot of angst about this area, and rightly so. We should think this through. It's a tough area. It's so important. So how do we respond? Well, I'm going to argue that we shouldn't just reject all of those claims, and a lot of the viewers of my channel will disagree with me about that. But first, and I'll just ask
For his viewers, like, what are they like? Reject it till we die. It's lies from Satan himself. Satan. I unless it's your field of study, it's hard to, you kind of, you can't outright reject something without evidence unless you're just going on pure, faith, you know. Well, you can't trust it. Look, all institutions are, you know, humans are in charge of them. They're going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. And as long as we keep pursuing truth, which I believe most people in these fields are trying to figure out the answers, trying to figure out what's right as far as what is true, what actually took place, we get more and more, we have better understanding than we did 20 years ago, better than what we did 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and so on. As far as like the scientific field is concerned, we keep pushing forward and we'll come to better and more accurate conclusions as time goes on, as we gather more evidence and find better ways of interpreting that evidence.
for patience and ask for your listening ears first. I'm condensing a lot of research down into a relatively short video here. I could just ask you to hear me out, okay? So first of all, let me highlight what I think we can't give up. And I think it's absolutely imperative to retain a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall, by which what I mean is minimally that Adam and Eve were real people in history. Okay, you could point over and look and see Adam walking around and Eve, and that the historical fall was a real event, and that this has a universal and ultimate explanatory significance for what it means to be human. In other words, Genesis 2-3 is telling us about real events in history that tell us most deeply who we really are. Okay? Why is that important? I'll give 3 reasons: a biblical, theological, and apologetical, or having to do with apologetics, specifically having to do with theodicy, or responding to the problem.
So I admire what this guy is trying to do, what Gavin is trying to do. Because it's kind of, he's talking pastoral. I'm guessing he's a pastor. This is what a pastor is supposed to do. There's a reason I personally left the Christian faith, because I don't find it to be, I find it to be inaccurate to reality. I do agree with probably around 80 to 85%, minimally 70%. And as I go through the Bible, that my confidence in that percentage is not great. You know, I might have a higher or lower agreement with Christianity and with the Bible as we go through this. Granted, grew up in the church. Somebody who, not what didn't take it. Let's say I was fairly active in my attempts at understanding. I was somebody who would defend Christianity. I was a passive participant in my faith. Growing up, I was fairly active. Not incredibly active, but fairly. So, I have my own background and why I give, anywhere from like a 75 to 85% range of agreeance with Christianity, but there's too many key issues with Christianity that I disagree with. Not just like apathetically, like, I don't know about this, but like, no, I don't agree with this, and I cannot support this. In the sense that I feel it would be inaccurate, and unacceptable for me to call myself a Christian. I'm a deist. That's probably the most broad term to use for what I believe in. I believe in a God. Let's not get into all that just right now. Just giving you a little broad strokes here. So yeah, I think my see, this is the issue. He's using sort of almost like he is using, in my opinion, he is using faith to justify his position on this. It's like, let's go back. Let's listen to
of humanity, and number 3, why is that important? I'll give 3 reasons:
why is
the
it
biblical, theological,
why is this important? Biblical, theological,
and apologetical.
Apologetical, uh, having to do with apologetics. For someone, so this is like from a Christian point of view, this makes sense. Those are the reasons. However, for me, it's like, what is true? That's all I need. That's the only reason. I don't need to justify any specific belief. You know, if it comes from something that didn't actually take place, then it doesn't belong because it's not factual.
Or having to do with apologetics, specifically having to do with theodicy, or responding to the problem of evil. So you could say the 3 reasons here are: number 1, the doctrine of Scripture; number 2, the doctrine of humanity; and number 3, the doctrine of evil. First, the doctrine of Scripture. If we have a high view of Scripture, as I do, if we think basically Scripture is trustworthy revelation from God, then we need to take seriously its portrayal of...
That's a big if for people outside of Christianity, outside of Abrahamic faith. That's a big if. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Adam. And it really looks like in the Bible, Adam is... it's tricky because Adam is employed in an array of archetypal and literary and typological ways. Nonetheless, he looks like a real person, okay, a real historical figure, and so also with Eve.
He looks, what do you mean he looks like? Oh, he's not breathing fire from his arse. Lightning bolts aren't coming from his arse. Seems like a real person to me. It seemed like he needed food to sustain himself. Excuse my silly accent. What does that even mean? He looks like a real person. Yeah, he didn't have 6 arms and 6 legs and 8 mountains to sustain himself. Sure. What do you know? He's portrayed as a human, a realistic human would be portrayed, as in he needs food to sustain himself, and da 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 da. Anyway, this is kind of like, I mean, it's a good start. Good start. He's not portrayed as a spider. He's not portrayed as a dragon. He's not portrayed as having some crazy superhuman powers, except for living to be like 1,000 years old. But let's forget about that for now.
And this is where I, in my writing on this, depart from some other treatments. I've mentioned like Scott McKnight and Peter Enns and others, who I think sometimes happens is because the idea of Adam is used as a kind of construct, or it's used as a type.
Does he not know that Adam and Eve actually refers to? It's more about the protons and it's about the nucleus and the electron. Adam, the atom, and then Eve, the electron. Or maybe Eve is the photon. I'm joking. I'm joking. Let's keep going. Look, I think he's doing a very good job from a Christian perspective for Christians. He's speaking to the choir right now, and I'm not a part of the choir. So I think he's doing a good job considering who he's trying to reach.
That is set over and against Adam's historicity. But you can have figures that function in a literary way or a typological way, like Melchizedek is an example of this in the book of Hebrews. He serves to represent a certain kind of priesthood. Adam is used like this in Jewish literature in the intertestamental period in the New Testament. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a real person. And in the Bible, Adam seems like a real dude. He seems like a real person. He's included in genealogies, 3 of them, Genesis 5, 1 Chronicles 1, and Luke 3. Now, by the way, if you're wondering here in Genesis 5 what it means when it says Adam begot Seth in his own image, that's a fascinating little phrase. I wrote a whole article on that phrase. I think it's really interesting. But this is really significant. To my awareness, there's not precedent for including a merely mythical or fictional person in a genealogy in ancient literature. I've not seen that, and I'm aware that people often claim that you don't really see that. So this is to me, this is the strongest way to just show we need a.
Wait. It's like just because something is unique does not make it actual. It's like, oh look, that nobody else does this. It's like, okay, all right, well done. This is unique. What else do you want me to say?
A real person named Adam that you could point to. And I would say it's even stronger than what people usually go to, and that's Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. Even though I think those passages are strongly suggestive, somebody could argue that you have a comparison there between Adam and Christ that is kind of disanalogous. Like a friend of mine once gave me this sample sentence as an example: Lady Liberty has founded our nation, and Adolf Hitler is setting out to destroy it. Somebody could say that during World War II. It's a meaningful, kind of a strange sentence, but it's a meaningful sentence. Just like when Paul talks about Adam, Christ, okay, yeah, you could maybe try to make a case that there's something going on like that where these two figures are not parallel in their historicity. But the genealogies, I don't know how any way around that, because genealogies don't deal with mythic people or people who are fictional, who don't really exist, or who are merely typological or something like that.
Well, it's clear that the people genuinely believed that that Adam was a real person, even back then. I don't think there was any sense back in the day that these people were mythological. I think, along with any other creation story that involves, a man and a woman being created, I believe there are other mythological stories out there. I believe the people back then, regardless of whether they had a genealogy for it, believed that those people actually, like, that was factual for them. Obviously, up until a certain point, you know, The further you get away from the instance or the claimed instance, the less likely people are to believe it. However, let's keep going. Let's keep going. Gotta stop interrupting, or else this will take up our entire time.
And with Adam, we have specific information about how long he lived, how old he was when he fathered certain children. I'll put up Genesis 5 again, for example. He's 130 years old when he has Seth. Now, even if you think the long ages are symbolical or something like that, still, we have the specific information of he's fathering certain children like Seth and Cain and Abel and so forth. In his commentary on Genesis, Augustine points to Adam's fathering of children as a reason not to interpret him as merely figurative, because he's basically saying, well, look, are the kids figurative too? You know, if Adam's not a real person, who was Cain's father? and that's a totally legitimate question. Only real people can have children, right? So that's
only real people can have children. Never before has somebody created a fictional story or historical fiction with the fictional character in the historical setting having a child. It's impossible. You can't do it. Only real people have children. I'm sorry, my dude. If this is what you are proposing, how Christians are meant to even, I guess, give forth good evidence to people that would like to, even such as myself, people like me, who would look at Adam and Eve with great skepticism. This consideration of only real people have children is you're not give me a lot to go on here. Now, the potential for Adam and Eve, if I were to take a swing at the potential for these to be real people, you got to get rid of a lot of these details are clearly going to get kind of tossed out the window. This might be an instance of I don't know, dude, a Lord dealing with his son, and then like his daughter, and then, you know, in a very well-to-do environment, and, you know, something like that. And maybe due to them, he got, you know, maybe the son got the daughter pregnant, so they had to be tossed out of the garden per se and make their own ends. And somehow that got reinterpreted after the flood, after a lot of different events. Somehow this story remained. That's like, and even that's like, I don't know. Trying to make Adam and Eve work feels like a trying to convince me that Mount Olympus existed and Zeus was actually there with all the, you know, all the Greek gods were on Mount Olympus chilling and doing things. That's how it feels for me to try to be like, yes, this is a real story. Wait, didn't Zeus have kids? Only real people have kids? What is this? Did I miss something? Hold on. I'm sorry. I don't mean to like be so. Whole point of this is to kind of be nitpicky, fortunately.
long ages are symbolical or something like that, still, we have the specific information of he's fathering certain children like Seth and Cain and Abel and so forth. In his commentary on Genesis, Augustine points to Adam's fathering of children as a reason.
If he too is to be understood figuratively, who was it who begot Cain and Abel and Seth? Or did they also exist in figure, also as real human beings? Yeah, this whole shenanigan is maybe there was, again, that's why I go, maybe the best we can do is that there was some kind of existence with them, with somebody in charge of them that they treated as God. And this is their story. And somehow it got warped over time. Hey, there are plenty of instances where different humans are like, I am a god. I am a god. You have plenty of different you have different leaders around the world and different instances throughout history that claim to be gods. Who's to say this wasn't one of those instances long ago where Adam and Eve were under somebody who claimed to be God. And things just got warped. The details got warped throughout many, 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 many generations in time and space.
And not to interpret him as merely figurative, because he's basically saying, well, look, are the kids figurative too? If Adam's not a real person, who was Cain's father? and that's a totally legitimate question. Only real people can have children, right? So that's biblically.
Let's keep going. Let's keep going.
Really looks like that's how Adam is being portrayed in the Bible. He's a real person, so is Eve. Secondly, and even more importantly, the doctrine of humanity.
I get the point that he's getting at. They are treated as real people. They are treated as real people. So I get what he's going for there.
Human beings are qualitatively different from the animal kingdom. There's different aspects of human uniqueness. You can think of like the image of God. You can think of the soul. Not everyone believes in a soul. I believe in a soul. That's the traditional view, that a dualism, your body and soul. Our moral capacities, like our accountability to God, our potential for falling into sinfulness and needing salvation, our rational faculties, like our capacities for language, and you can add on other things as well. Some of these people try to dispute in terms of how qualitative is this difference, when people talk about human beings as rational, and actually people try to point out like the upper level mammals like dolphins, and they try to say it's just a quantitative difference. But from a classic Christian standpoint, you have to recognize there are at least some things about human beings that are qualitatively unique, like the doctrine of the image of God, for example. We don't think that dolphins are made in the image of God. Okay. So then you say, how do you explain human uniqueness apart from a punctiliar starting point to humanity? And by human uniqueness, you could just include all the things you think that are qualitatively unique about human beings. And what you get to very quickly is you see a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall is an incredibly useful, and I would say necessary.
I would agree with him on the usefulness of it, only in its simplicity of, I think I found it, a lot of people find it useful when things are explained in more simple terms. That it's just easier to digest than the idea that potentially consciousness, self-awareness, complexity of language and thought gradually got stronger and stronger over time. And to say that there's this one moment where humanity was created, and it's a narrative that's just far easier to just use that as a foundational understanding rather than the gradual increase. And how much did they understand? How much did proto Homo sapiens understand and what have you? Did they have, when did they start even thinking or even having the thought of there being a creator? Do dolphins think that there's a creator? Like you said, dolphins aren't, da 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 da. What are there other animals? Well, we can't really, not from, we haven't been able to prove any of that, so we can't say that they do think that there is a creator or even have thoughts even resembling, even coming close to that kind of thought process. So yes, it can be useful in that sense. A lot of different beliefs can be useful even if they're not necessarily true.
Explanatory mechanism for that qualitative uniqueness and for the transmission of that qualitative uniqueness to everybody else around the globe. Because you don't get, it's very hard to see how you get qualitative uniqueness sequentially, if you're just like,
Again, it's very difficult. Yes, it's I agree. It's not as easy as um Adam and Eve. I agree. It takes far more there's a lot more, almost like there's more unknowns surrounding it to the average person, especially, and even in the scientific world, even if you ask people who are extremely learned in these fields, like how aware of themselves and what have you, how self-aware were like Homo erectus or Neanderthals. We have some different, like, well, they could use tools, they could do this, but we can't really interview somebody who's a Neanderthal. We can't really interview a Homo. They're not around anymore. So yeah, the idea of gradual is leaves a lot more, makes it the past feel a bit more ambiguous on what they understood and why, sure, why do we understand so much compared to all the other animals and what have you.
evolving along, it's hard to see how you wouldn't have like, well, now they're 80% made in the image of God and then 81%, and so forth. So historical Adam and Eve basically puts the pieces of the puzzle together for just having what we theologically.
The other potential is that this is all in the image of God, the whole universe, not just human beings. I think it's also one of those things where I might even just disagree with the idea that human beings are the only thing in the image of God, that the whole universe is, potentially. And I think human beings are a little self-centered. And so it makes sense to me that somebody would believe or even sort of surmise that human beings are made in the image of God.
Want to say about human beings. The third reason would be, and this is in some respects the most poignant one, is the problem of evil. So it's really a concern if we make God the author of evil. And that applies to other things in the world, but it also applies to human nature. Without a historical fall, without a before and after, without a, we were good and then we became bad, we were innocent and then we fell into guilt, it's very hard to see how we don't make God the author of evil.
Yeah. That's not really a problem for me, but it is a problem for Christianity for sure. There's a difference between being the author of evil and being the author of the potential for evil, in my book at least. And that goes along with free will and what have you. Allowing evil is much different than perpetuating it. So let's keep going.
Think of like in some of my other videos on my video advocating for the moral argument, I talked about chimpanzee wars. And I was trying to, there's these famous, it's fascinating, these like 4-year wars going on between these different tribes of chimpanzees and so forth. Well, if you're just going from the animal kingdom where like horrific violence is just par for the course, and you just slowly, quantitatively get into human beings, and there's never any kind of threshold where you cross where there's a period at which we are good and then we become bad, it's very hard to see how God isn't the author of evil. And this is a real big concern. It's a helpful article in this book I'll put up on the screen that Henri Blocher talks about this, and he just warns against this. And he's saying, we need to see evil and sinfulness as an alien intrusion into God's good creation, and that applies to human nature.
We need to? Why? Why do we need to? That is my question currently. Maybe you'll answer that, but you're saying we need to, but why?
Jamie Smith has a similar point in his article in this book, which I'll put up. He talks about this as the danger of naturalizing sin, and this is a real concern. So I'm being brief and I'm abstracting from a lot more, by the way. Sorry if I talk about my books too much, but this is all coming out of this book. If you're interested more in this, Retrieving Augustine's Doctrine of Creation, it's in the video description. Check it out. But minimally, what I'm trying to say now is we need a historical Adam and Eve as real people, a historical fall as a real event, and this is the explanation of the human story. Okay? However,
Yeah, from his perspective, from the Christian perspective, yeah, to uphold the very fabric of Christianity as believed by, I would say, the majority of Christian sects out there, you do need this to be upheld. As somebody who's no longer a Christian, I don't have any necessity to uphold these things. So it is interesting to hear, this does feel like I'm peering back into my earlier life of being a Christian and listening to this just with a new, a new set of eyes, essentially.
that leaves open a lot of questions. If you're paying attention to those 4 questions I put out at the front, the second numbers 2 through 4 are still kind of open here. And what I want to argue is that there's a need, and this is the second main argument of this video, is that, and this is going to take longer, okay? We should be patient with the possibility of harmonizing this true historical account we have in the early chapters of Genesis with the current paleoanthropological and genetic claims. In other words, it's legitimate to consider efforts at harmonizing a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall with evolutionary science. And I'm not going to tell you how to close the lid on this, and I don't know how to do it. And I'm not going to say here's exactly how it all fits together. But I'm arguing for a certain posture. I'm saying it's legitimate to look into this, to be patient with this, to consider this. The arguments I'm going to give for this are from the text of Scripture. I'm not going to argue from science, okay? I'm not a scientist, so I kind of leave that to the side. But that's obviously a real issue as well. I'm not saying that's unimportant, but I'm going to speak from my own area as a theologian and just make 2 points to argue for a posture and a disposition of humility, open-mindedness, consideration, give this careful review, and then I'll give you some options that people have proposed, but I'm not going to say here's exactly how you have to come to a conclusion. But patience for the process. That's all I'm trying to argue at this point. It's a modest goal, okay? Because
he's doing a good job as far as like a Christian leader with this material. I think he's got a good level-headed sort of point of view with all of this. So I do want to give him credit for that.
Frankly, a lot of people aren't very patient for that, and they're kind of like, oh, why would you ever do that? I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's what we need. Let me give 2 reasons why. From the Scripture. The first one is Genesis 4. I think there are features in the text of the early chapters of the Bible, especially Genesis chapter 4, that invite questions about the possibility of other people outside the Garden of Eden. And this is what comes up with Genesis 4, which is a hugely neglected and important chapter. By the way, Genesis 4 is part of the same literary unit. So you got Genesis 1, that's kind of its own thing, big picture creation. And you've got Genesis 2 and 3. Genesis 4 is a part of that same literary unit, and then you have a block with the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5. So when you go from Genesis 2 to 3 to Genesis 4, you're going from the Garden of Eden to outside the Garden of Eden. Your geographical reference is expanding outwards. By the way, the very fact that there's a Garden of Eden at all is interesting. The whole world is not the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is this special, unique sanctuary place of God's presence. When you get out of that place and you look around, you notice some curious things. First, Cain, the first generation son of Adam and Eve, is introduced as having a wife without any explanation. Yes, I know how people explain that. We'll talk about that. But it's just interesting. It's like, oh, he's got a wife. Okay. Second, when he's banished to wander throughout the earth, he's afraid that others will find him and kill him. Okay. That's really interesting. Third, he builds a city. Okay. Now,
Well, you might get into this, but cities, I think, in the text, I think was used kind of loosely to mean like dwellings for your family, not just for yourself, but it was like dwellings for you and your kin.
traditional answer on a lot of this in the main is that this is his brothers and sisters. Okay. He's marrying his sister. He's afraid of his brothers or slightly distant relatives, nieces and nephews as you go a little further and so forth. And he's building a city with his nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters and so forth. These are all just Adam's other children. Here is the thing about that. I'll often have people who, when I'm advocating, say, hey, let's keep an open mind about this. Maybe there's harmonization efforts like what John Stott and others have argued for that I'm going to get into in the third section of this video. People often say, oh, that's just so obviously not what the text is describing, right? But the thing that I come back to is I think the alternatives are not so obvious either.
Wait, what's obvious? I must have missed something.
And he's building a city with his nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters and so forth. These are all just Adam's other children. Here is the thing about that. I'll often have people who, when I'm advocating, say, hey, let's keep an open mind about this. Maybe there's harmonization efforts like what John Stott and others have argued for that I'm going to get into in the third section of this video. People often say, oh, that's just so obviously not what the text is describing, right? But the thing that I come back to is I think the alternatives are not so obvious either. All of the different views have some awkward points, not just because of the moral problem of incest and the way people have to explain that, which is not in the text.
Well, it wasn't, I don't think it was considered immoral yet. There were no, from what the text is described, there weren't any laws against it yet. So anyway, let's keep going.
People explain the sort of exception to the later prohibitions against incest. That's not something you get from the text. It's not explicit. You're reading that onto the text, but more just the more basic question is just what's the natural reading here? As you go outside the geographical locale of the Garden of Eden, it kind of looks like there's just other people around. And I think that's a very natural way to read the text. Those who disagree with that, those who say, oh, no, and whatever, that's complete capitulation to evolution and modern scientific claims.
Hold on. It doesn't say when. Hold on. I got my Bible right here. If I remember correctly. Let's see. Doesn't say exactly when this took place. I mean, as far as like how old Adam and Eve were at the time when Cain murdered Abel. There could have been many other people that Adam and Eve had given birth to, And then so it's not like that wild to think that there are other people, Anyway, let's keep rolling.
There's nothing in the text. You're just jamming that into the text. I would say not only is the alternative view, the traditional view, kind of odd as well, but you might be interested to know that a lot of people have wondered about this before any theories of evolution came about, before Charles Darwin wrote Origin of Species. People have looked at Genesis 4 for a long time and wondered about this. So in the early years after Darwin, you find relatively conservative theologians, a lot of them trying to build harmonization efforts between what Darwin was saying, and these are conservative theologians, and I've talked about this before in other videos, that the dominant immediate response of conservative and even fundamentalist Christians was not just like rejection of what Darwin was saying. But the thing is, when they were doing this, they were building on a prior tradition of thought. Okay, there had been a long tradition of speculation about pre-Adamites. In what I'm about to get into, I'm not saying this is all correct, but I just want to show how people have always wrestled with Genesis 4, and this goes way back before evolution. A couple of years before The Origins of Species was published, the prominent British Orientalist and lexicographer Edward William Lane generated a huge controversy for his proposal that basically you have pre-Adamites who are continuing in existence after Adam and intermarry with the Adamic line. And one of his big arguments is from Genesis 4. He's citing Genesis 4, 14 to 17, what I just referenced, and he's saying, this doesn't seem like a natural reading of the words to say that we've got, he's just afraid of his brothers and he's marrying his sister and so forth. And he was not the first person. He himself was drawing on a long tradition that really goes back to Isaac La Peyrère. Okay, I think I'm pronouncing this is a French lawyer and cartographer, meaning someone who builds maps in the 17th century. In 1655, he published this book called Men Before Adam. And he's basically talking, he drew his view from Romans 5:13, but also from other passages. And this generated this huge tradition of thought where a lot of people are wrestling with this and they're considering this. And by the way, if you want a good book about all this, David Livingstone, Adam's Ancestors, fascinating book. He goes into far more detail about this than you probably want, but he shows how common this became in the 17th century, 18th century, people thinking like this. And a big part of the reason this got a lot of traction is because of Genesis 4. A lot of people struggled to see the biblical text as really teaching that Cain is the third man of the world. And a lot of these people are pretty conservative. Let me just give an example more recently. R.A. Torrey. Okay, he's at the heart of the fundamentalist response to liberalism. He's one of the editors of the book, The Fundamentals. He had a key role in institutions like Biola and Moody Bible Institute, very conservative, you might even say in kind of the fundamentalist type space places, okay, early 20th century and so forth. And but he thought, so this is not a liberal, okay, but he's thinking from the text of Scripture, from Genesis 4, and he's thinking that Genesis 1, 3, and following is not talking about the creation of the world, but the reconstruction of a world that had been decimated by the sin of some pre-Adamic race. And he basically said it may be that these ancient civilizations, which are being discovered in the vicinity of Nineveh and elsewhere, may be the remains of the pre-Adamic race already mentioned. And he's going on about that. You can read that quote. There are lots of people who have wondered about this because of Genesis 4, just from the text alone. It's not dumb or liberal to just wonder, like, once you get outside the garden, it kind of looks like there's some other people around. Okay, that leads to my second point, which will focus us in more on Genesis 2 to 3 a bit more. Here's the point I want to make here. There is a difference between historicity and literalism. This is such a basic point, but sometimes I've been surprised that in my dialogue on these issues, it doesn't always get traction. And sometimes people actually not only accidentally conflate those two things, but even resist their distinction, even though they're pretty obviously different. So we really need to press this point a bit. Historicity is about whether a text is talking about historical events. Literalism has to do with how those historical events are related. And it's pretty obvious that the Bible is very keen on talking about historical events in ways that are not literalistic. Now, I'm going to use the word literalistic a lot more frequently because the word literal actually has kind of a range of meanings. I'm talking about literal.
Yeah, when I think literal, I always think of the common way people use it even today, or how I would even use it. Like, he literally punched him in the face. No, he didn't say words that would be akin to punching somebody in the face. He literally punched him in the face, as in That is factually what took place. That fist hit him right in the cheek. You know what I mean? With a punch. Like what I'm saying is dot by dot factually true. That's what I think of when I think literal. So a literal reading of the Bible, when I hear that and when I think about that, is where line by line, this is either exactly how it took place or as close to exact as to be treated as exact. And then, okay, so historicity, I'm just gonna write some of this down. Historicity is whether an event is based off. Hold on, let me make sure that I'm understanding it correctly.
In ways that are not literalistic. Now, I'm going to use the word literalistic a lot. A text is talking about historical events. Literalism has to do with how those historical events are related. And it's pretty obvious that the Bible is very keen on talking about historical events in ways that are not literalistic. Now, I'm going to use the word literalistic a lot more frequently because the word literal actually has kind of a range of meanings. I'm talking about literalistic, a very wooden way of reading the text just at face value, not being open to any sort of stylization or elevation or imagery and so forth, symbolization in narration and in description of historical events. But the Bible.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was hoping he was gonna say. Or else I'd be like, wait, what other version of literal, are people using these days that I'm not aware of? All right, let's keep going.
Bible has so much that is about history, but it's not literalistic. And it's not just like apocalyptic literature like Daniel and Revelation. It's huge portions of the wisdom and prophetic literature like the night visions of Zechariah 3. A favorite example of mine is Habakkuk 3, talking about historical events in a very visual and stylized way. You even have poems and songs embedded into the historical literature of the Bible, like Deborah's song in Judges 5. It's clearly talking about historical events, but it's not doing so in a literalistic way. And then, even within the historical books of the Bible, there are kind of different registers. So the question comes up, what kind of historical narration is Genesis 1 through 11? It's true, it's trustworthy, and it's telling us history, but it's doing so in its own elevated, more broad stroke manner. And pretty much all interpreters of the book of Genesis recognize, oh yeah, the narrative kind of slows down and changes a little bit in Genesis 12. Okay. What you have in Genesis 1 through 11 is a little bit different from, say, the Gospel of Luke. And it's certainly different from modern historiography. Let me give some examples of people who are not liberals who make this recognition. J.I. Packer, he talks about how Genesis 1 through 11, he distinguishes this in its poetic prose mode of narration with its pictorial, imaginative, quasi-liturgical phraseology, its paucity of mere information, and its drumbeat formulae. He distinguishes that from the ordinary narrative prose mode of Genesis 12 through 50. But J.I.
So for anybody who doesn't know, chapters 1 through 11 is basically Adam and Eve creation, flood, post-flood. And then when you get to chapter 12 through 50, it's about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So there is a very keen separation between chapters 1 through 11 and then 12 through 50. And that's what he's talking about.
Packer is very vigorous in rejecting labels like legend or saga or epic or myth or tale to describe Genesis 1 through 11. And he's saying, no, these are space-time history, although told in Moses's chosen incantatory poetic way. Elsewhere, he talks about, in another writing, he talks about the early chapters of Genesis as historical events, but shrouded in the mists of antiquity and communicated in a subtle and secret manner. J.I. Packer is no liberal. He's, on record staunchly defending biblical inerrancy and so forth. He was a wonderful man of God. Okay, he's not, but he's just recognizing the kind of literature that we're working with here. By the way, it's not a virtue to be really wooden and literalistic in how you read the Bible. That can actually be a way of dishonoring the scripture if it goes against the intention of the author. The way to honor the scripture is to sort of cooperate and yield to the way it's trying to communicate with us. Okay. Here's another example. Henri Blocher, he's a
I mean, I think you should read, in my opinion. I mean, this is how I'll just say this is how I read the Genesis. Just keeping kind of an open mind, but also just like, looking for themes, but also like trying to really get a good grasp of what the text is actually saying. I mean, going through with somewhat of a looking at it from a literal perspective, you shouldn't limit yourself to a literal perspective, but when you're reading any kind of text, that's generally where we start. Even when you're reading poetry, you're letting your imagination flow, but there's also disconnected. It says OBS disconnected. What is happening here? OBS reconnection successful. All right, well. So what I'd say is you want to keep almost like reading something literally is a tool. You want to have a toolbox of when you're reading text, especially like the Bible, of different ways that you can read it. And so you want having a literal tool in your toolbox while you're reading it is good, but that doesn't mean that you want to just use one tool for the whole thing. You know.
French evangelical theologian, very conservative. He's on record. He wrote a book defending original sin. He's resisting the general lunge toward kind of revisionist views in the modern era. But he describes Genesis 1 through 4 as distinct from straightforward ordinary history as another historical genre, that of a well-crafted childlike drawing of the far distant past, with illustrative and typological interests uppermost. Something like the images carved on the tympans of Romanesque cathedrals and the stories told by their stained glass windows. Isn't that powerful imagery? So, what I'm trying to say is there's a danger of interpreting these chapters of the Bible too literalistically, and to show that this concern is not just rooted in theological liberalism. Let's look at pre-modern exegesis of these passages.
All right. I'm gonna take a 5-minute break, gonna have a cigarette, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes. We'll keep rolling. All right, let's get back to it.
Of course, I'm going to talk about Augustine now because I love Augustine and because he's so helpful on these. He wrote 5 commentaries on Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, more than all the other church fathers. He delivered more than anyone kind of the most mature body of reflection on these chapters in Scripture. And I've argued in my book that the doctrine of creation is sort of central to his entire thought. It's really important to him. And he put a lifetime of work into it. And this is the most important theologian in the early church, certainly in terms of his significance. Now, Augustine believes in a historical Adam and a historical Eden and fall account. But let me just take you through some passages and show you how balanced he is and cautious and careful he is and sophisticated he is in that. And these passages are going to blow your mind if you've assumed that a wooden literalism is the way to be faithful to the Bible. First, here's how he describes the creation of Adam's body. But in what manner did God make him from the mud of the earth? Was it straightway as an adult, that is, as a young man in the prime of life? Or was it as he forms human beings from then until now in their mother's wombs? Isn't that an interesting question? I mean, who is asking that question today? Augustine leaves that question open. He wonders whether it's even our business to ask about that. And he asserts that whichever of these God did, after all, he did what was in the power of a God both omnipotent and wise and what befitted him to do. By the way, in his commentaries on Genesis, Augustine is always kind of saying these kinds of things. He's always raising questions saying, who knows? God did whatever is best. You don't need to know. He's incredibly cautious and sort of strictured in sort of what he requires you to believe in. He's always going back to
What I would say is, I believe God gives us the information we need at the time that we need it. I don't think he, as far as what I can tell, God is not one to overwhelm humanity with knowledge that they don't need at that time yet. You gotta love mystery. I believe God loves a good mystery, and I believe humanity does as well. And I think God and humanity agree that mystery is a wonderful thing. So I do believe that God gives us what we need as far as knowledge is concerned in the moment that is appropriate for it.
to the rule of faith, saying that's what you focus on. Be grounded in that. Take a bullet for the rule of faith, the central, like the Apostles' Creed Christianity. But these kind of more detailed questions of how do you interpret these ancient texts, he's much more circumspect about. To defend that open posture of the question of is Adam born? Was Adam created as a 21-year-old body or as a baby who grew up? He says basically that when things develop from a latent to a manifest state of being, this in no way entails that God abdicated the supremacy over everything of his will. So do you see what he's saying there? He's saying God can create slowly. If God creates the seed and the seed grows into the tree, fine. God still made the tree. And he's basically being open. I mean, you can see his openness. It's amazing. He's saying it doesn't matter whether Adam was made as a grown man or as a baby, because either way, God made him. That's amazing. By the way, this whole principle is this idea of the seminal reasons or the causal principles, and it's translated in many other ways. This is a huge discussion. I'll put up the Latin words of this. In my book, I have a section discussing whether this principle of a...
I guess one thing we can, one thing we can agree upon, if God made Adam, it was in one manner or another. I think that's sort of the clutch of the issue. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily really matter that much. I mean, it could, but if it did, it should have made it into the text, but clearly it didn't, so therefore it probably doesn't matter that much for our purposes.
Augustine, how it's similar to evolution, how it's different from evolution, whether it's supportive of evolution, has been a huge point of controversy since the late 19th century, when, as recounted by this fascinating book, the distinguished Roman Catholic physicist who taught at the University of Notre Dame, John Zahm, made that connection. And there's a huge thing in the literature is, The similarity is, and other people like Alistair McGrath in today's world have made this connection between this principle of Augustine, this idea that God can plant the seeds and then things grow out of the seeds, and God is no less the author of that. And to what extent is that similar to the idea of evolution? It's not hard to see how it is similar in some ways. Okay, and I'll put up what Zom said. You can see that. So, okay, we're moving along here. I'll try not to get too bogged down in Augustine. This is what happens. I make a video about creation, and I get to the section on Augustine, and it's like a huge portion. But it's because I've done a lot of research in this, and I think it's interesting, and I think it's important. I mean, isn't it interesting already? Just wait till we're going to go next. You see Augustine's flexibility on the question of the nature of Adam's body and age at the time of his creation. Now look where he goes next. This is really going to alleviate some anxiety out there for somebody, probably, hopefully. Okay? What Augustine basically does is he goes through in his final, summative, literal commentary on Genesis is he's insisting on the basics. He's insisting upon a historical Adam, a historical fall, but he's incredibly flexible on how to understand the details of that. So in Book 6 of his literal commentary, he poses this question of whether Adam, while in the Garden of Eden, had the kind of body that we'll have at the resurrection. And he's uncomfortable with that because he wants to take the trees and the fruits mentioned in Genesis 2-3 in a historical sense. And he thinks that's hard to square with Adam having a fully glorified body. And then he offers this concession, though. But if no other solution can be found, it is better that we should opt for understanding paradise in a spiritual sense. So this is talking about a figurative or symbolical reading of the Garden of Eden and these details he's just recounted. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't seem that strong. How do you know what he means in a spiritual sense? Okay, I'm telling you, that's what he...
I mean, in a spiritual sense, I would think, in my opinion, is probably the better way to read the Adam and Eve story. I'm not saying that it is necessarily the best way, but probably a better way compared to literal. I think you'll probably get more from it from that perspective than a literal reading.
He means, and let me show that by going through. He gets to this again in Book 8. Okay, Book 8 of the literal commentary. He starts off and he just poses the question. There are three options. He poses the question basically. There was Adam a real person, and was Eden a real place? And it's very interesting that he's aware there's a range of opinions about this. He says, I am not ignorant that many people have said many things about this paradise. And he says there's three generally held opinions about this. First, those who interpret Eden bodily as a real physical environment. Second, those who interpret it spiritually as a symbol or type. And third, those who interpret the Garden of Eden in both senses as a real physical environment on planet Earth and a spiritual type or symbol of heaven. And then the same question is with Adam. Is he just a type of humanity? And Augustine favors option 3. He says it's both symbolical and a real thing, but then he strictures that and he leaves space for option 2. This is the amazing thing. So basically, by the way, with option 2 there, some people think that he's talking, they're like, what is he talking about? Who are these people he's talking about? We know Augustine's own conversion story. He was famously impacted by Ambrose's allegorical preaching on Genesis 1. But at this point, he's probably talking about Origen's view. Origen was hugely influential, especially before he became more controversial later on. And Origen had advocated for a symbolical interpretation of Genesis 1-3, not just Genesis 1. I'll put up this passage. You can see he's basically saying he finds it kind of silly to believe that this is all literal, that God has planted these actual trees and there's a visible and palpable tree that you can see there, and God is walking in the garden and so forth. I'm not endorsing Origen right now. I'm just saying that
Hold on. And who could be found so silly as to believe that God, after the manner of a farmer, planted trees eastward in Eden and set therein a tree of life, that is, a visible and palpable tree of wood of such a sort that anyone who ate of this tree with bodily teeth would gain life, and again that anyone who ate of another tree would get a knowledge of good and evil. And further, when God is said to walk in the paradise in the evening, and Adam to hide himself behind a tree, I do not think anyone will doubt that these statements are made in Scripture in a figurative manner, in order that through them certain mystical truths may be indicated. Okay, let's see. And who could be found so silly? Okay, in order that through them, um, you know, always it's not impossible that there was a tree of life and a tree of good and evil. It's not impossible, but yes, it does. It's interesting how we when people choose to apply what I would consider pragmatic um understanding of the text, you know, I think it is necessary, but there's sort of like, okay, well, it doesn't, if the literal interpretation doesn't work, let's move from that and let's go to, okay, let's think about this pragmatically. Um, I mean, what? I mean, what? Are you saying God wouldn't want to walk through the paradise? Why not? I mean, why can't God go take a walk and kind of, put himself in a more like his consciousness in a more singular, focused position where he's walking through the paradise, like, it's pretty good. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not crazy. Uh, but yes, it does seem far-fetched for sure for there to be a set tree of life and a set tree of good and evil. Far-fetched. Um, so let's keep going.
You know, there's a visible and palpable tree that you can see there, and God is walking in the garden and so forth. I'm not endorsing Origen right now. I'm just saying that view is out there on the table. Lots of people used to say there's actually a lot of parallels between Augustine's exegesis of Genesis 1 through 3 and Origen's ideas. And a lot of people used to try to account for that through intermediate texts, like Hilary's treatises on the Psalms and Gregory of Elvira's treatise on the creation of man, Ambrose, his homilies. But in recent years, Georgi Heidel has argued for a direct influence. Basically, he says, no, there was a Latin compilation of Origen's views circulating around the 4th century. So Augustine probably has Origen in mind here, okay? And basically, and that's actually, but you can see other views floating around at that time too, where it's more figurative interpretation of Genesis 2 to 3. So Augustine basically comes along and he says, the option 3 is correct. It's not just figurative, it's both typological and historical. However, there are many who accept the authority of Scripture who opt for option 2. Quote, I am addressing, of course, those who accept the authority of these sacred writings. Some of them, you see, are not prepared to have paradise understood literally and properly, but only figuratively. End quote. And then he's distinguishing this from the more insidious position of the Manichaeans, this non-Christian group. Quote, as for those who are altogether opposed to these writings, I've dealt with them elsewhere in a different way. And then he's basically saying that those people that deserve a harsher rebuke, but these people of ours who have faith in these divine books are not prepared to have paradise understood to the proper literal sense. So he's making a distinction between these two different options, Origenism and Manichaeism. And then here's the concession that he offers. Concerning Genesis 2 to 3, he says, certainly, he's arguing against Origenism. He's saying, no, I think it needs to be historical. But then he offers this concession. Certainly, if the bodily things mentioned here could not in any way at all be taken in a bodily sense that accorded with truth, what other course would we have but to understand them as spoken figuratively, rather than impiously to find fault with Holy Scripture? So you see here his concern to uphold the truthfulness of Scripture, but he's cautious about interpretation. And he has lots of different passages like this. Now, again, the greater portion of his writings is he's defending. These are real historical events. Adam was a real person. There was a historical fall, but he's offering this concession. He's saying, if it should turn out that this is wrong, then that's how we'd have to interpret Scripture. Later in the literal commentary, he makes a similar concession with regard to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He's defending the historicity of various elements in Genesis 3, and he pauses to reflect awareness of a particular alternative view in which this basically Adam and Eve were eating of the tree too early before they were ready for it. And as he's considering that view, he says, if by any chance these people mean to take that tree in a figurative sense, not as a real one with real apples, this opinion may possibly lead to ideas that are agreeable to right, faith, and the truth. So again, you see his willingness to be concessive. He's saying, this is what I think is true, but if I'm wrong about it, here's what you could take. And I know for a lot of modern readers, this is going to be shocking because Augustine is on the more quote unquote conservative side in terms of church fathers when it comes to this stuff. And he's often set over and against someone like Irenaeus in terms of having a more matured view of Adam and Eve.
Just so everybody kind of understands where I'm at with all this. These figures and people he's speaking of, I know not of who he speaks, so I'm kind of like listening and being like, okay, this person, okay, clearly he's an older church father. Like, I'm learning about just these individuals that he's speaking of as I'm trying to ascertain perspectives on the text itself, which is the main purpose of this stream. I'm researching Genesis, so I'm trying to like, okay, don't necessarily need to know about Irenaeus, whoever these different early church fathers were. So hopefully we'll get to more substantial answers in regards to Genesis as we go. We've gotten some, of course. They're trickling in.
But it's just amazing. The point here is this. Modern Christians often assume that the best way to read Genesis 1 through 11 is this kind of straightforward, photographic, historical narration, just like modern historiography. But all throughout church history, there's been an appreciation of the more imagistic way that these chapters are functioning. And you can see the symbolism of the story comes up all throughout Jewish and early Christian interpretation. Adam often functions, by the way, as a type or symbol for Israel in Jewish interpretation, and in patristic interpretation, Eve as a type for Mary, Eden as a type for Mount Sinai, and banishment from Eden as a type for exile to Babylon. Okay, so they're still reading it as a historical text, but they're seeing all this rich kind of significance and symbolism in the text. So this is Augustine's ultimate kind of legacy for us, I suggest. He's very concerned about the historicity and the core message, but he's pretty open about how literally to take the details. I'll just give one other example. In The City of God, he's very aware. He's talking about how some wonder why Cain built a city when there were only 3 people on earth. And he says, well, the writer of the sacred history does not necessarily mention all the men who might be alive at that time, but those only whom the scope of his work required him to name. Now, what a sentence, right? Wow. I want to try to be clear. I want to try to be fair to Augustine. He does seem to think that Cain was the third person, okay? He does seem to think that everybody's biologically related to Adam and Eve. This is where Augustine can be kind of confusing. That's the thing that's so interesting. He'll throw out these possibilities like this. And you can just tell he's not even anxious about trying to harmonize everything that he might say. But the point is, he's a lot more flexible in his hermeneutic than we often think, okay? So if we're kind of open ourselves up to say, okay, what if the text is telling us the true history, but but we're kind of trying to be sensitive to how it's narrating history. The fact is, this leaves open. No one thinks that Genesis is like talking about evolution. What is a possibility is that it's simply leaving a lot of things open, just like Augustine said in The City of God. It's just outside of the purview of the text. It's just not going into it at all. So let me just give one example of the kind of thing where
Yeah, I mean, the story, by my estimation, the story of Adam and Eve is a story that a bunch of became kind of the Israelite creation myth. a story that probably got passed down from generation to generation for a very long time before it was eventually written down. And who knows how that story evolved, devolved, what have you, over many, many different generations before it finally got written down as this is the definitive version of Adam and Eve that we are writing in our text as like, there it is. We're finally setting it. We're not changing it anymore. So I don't think any of those people really had a full scope of the importance of it. It became probably the story became more and more important as the Israelites, as different events took place. It's like, oh, this is like, Mount Sinai is like, you know, uh, the garden, or this, that, and the other, or getting exiled out to Babylon, sort of like how Adam and Eve got exiled. So like as time went on, they connected certain events to their creation myth, essentially, which is fascinating. It does feel like the creation of Adam and Eve is treated far more personally than through time compared to many other creation myths through other cultures. Though some cultures, there are some other cultures I do believe out there that do have a bit more of a personal kind of attachment, or formed more of a personal attachment, while others seem a little bit more impersonal. But, but many times, you know, I guess personal in the way of connecting certain events that happen to them, to their people, and looking back at how there's certain patterns of applying what had happened to what is happening now, which I find unique because I don't know if any other cultures really did that per se. All right.
There's a need for caution and more openness that the text simply leaves open. And that is the creation of Adam from the dirt. And a similar point could be made about the creation of Eve from the rib of Adam, that this may have more of a kind of archetypal or symbolical meaning than just giving you straight up photographic history. I'll put up Genesis 2:7. Augustine had some great cautions about this passage as well, and God's breathing and how do you understand that and all that. But basically, this is just a representative of a larger area here of how literally do we read these texts, how literalistically, right? And a lot of people, I think, just instinctively conceptualize that when God created Adam, it was from the dust, from the ground. He's the man of dust from the ground. So it was, brown particles of dirt coalescing upwards into human flesh in like immediate process, whether it takes 1 second or 10 seconds. It's just like zoom, there it is, from the physical dirt into a 21
I mean, I'm under the opinion it took 24 seconds, but let's not quibble.
year old body. I don't think the text actually requires us to take it like that. I think there's actually room for a lot of patience to just think about, well, what is the text actually saying? What would the original hearers have been concerned about? Consider how the dust imagery is used all throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. One chapter later, Adam is told at the conclusion of the curse against him, for you are dust, and to dust you will return. Okay, so he's made from the dust, but he is dust, present tense, and he will return to the dust. So the use of the present tense, dust, invites the question, if Adam's living body at the time of that curse being given to him was dust, and if he's going to return to the dust, this raises questions that are legitimate to then ask about the origins of Adam's body from the dust, right? You don't have to have a lot of imagination to start to wonder, well, in what sense is Adam currently dust? Obviously, that's not like the brown particles you sweep up with a broom, that kind of dust, right? And then we find this language applied to all human beings all throughout the scripture. Ecclesiastes 3:20 says that all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Psalm 103:14 says God knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. Job 10:9 through 10 combines the dust imagery with the clay and potter imagery to use for Job's own creation and death. I don't think people argue that Job couldn't have had biological ancestors or something like that. Paul picks up this imagery in 1 Corinthians 15:48. Basically, as was the man of dust, I'll put up the Greek word there, so also are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are. So you see, the dust being made of the dust. It's not easy to just assume that that's trying to give you photographic imagery to know just how it happened. It seems very possible that maybe Genesis 2:7 is making a more general claim about the nature of Adam. It's saying he's dust, i.e., he's not like the angels. In other words, maybe the dust here is talking not about the exact process by which Adam was made or the precise physical substance with which he was made, but rather his physicality as such and his consequent mortality. And if so, then this question the text just isn't addressing questions that would come up with evolution. Now, I'm not committing myself to evolution or to any theory like that. I'm actually not being a scientist. I kind of stay open on the details. My basic position, try to be completely transparent because I think that builds trust because I know a lot of people are suspicious and cynical of everything I'm saying here. My basic
He's biased? No. How dare you be a human being with your own biases and perspectives and experiences that influence how you interact with your own reality and how you display yourself and your own truths and don't worry, bro. Anybody with a level head understands you're doing the best you can with what you got.
position is it looks like God has used some long process that has involved evolution, but I'm just uncertain about the details because I'm not a scientist. So I just leave it open and I say, let these conversations that are going on about this rumble on. And, but so I'm not trying to like come down and say, here's how you have to understand it. I'm trying to inculcate patience with the biblical text and how it's functioning. It's not so obvious how you always take this imagery in these passages. Now, I know this makes people nervous. And I know I'm well aware, one of the things I can say is I know people like Christian Mario will mock me for this kind of stuff. Other of like the watchdog type bloggers and stuff will call me a liberal and a heretic for this kind of stuff. I understand that, and I understand the worries, and I understand how too it can seem from a certain angle, especially if you haven't really studied this very much or known godly Christians who went this route, as in America, it's very much like that a lot of times, as opposed to somewhere like the UK. I understand how that can happen, and I understand the anxieties that can come up. But there's multiple dangers here. The only danger is not an over adaptation to scientific claims resulting in liberalism, but also an under responsiveness resulting in fundamentalism. And in previous videos, I've talked about heliocentrism as an example of that, and the way the church responded to scientific evidence for heliocentrism as an example of that danger that we need to be sensitive to. So my plea would be, if someone is watching this video and you're saying anything you're talking about, this effort to be open, this willingness to consider harmonization between historical Adam and Eve and contemporary evolutionary science, anything like that, if you're just disagreeing with that, I would say three things. And I would just honestly beg you for these things. Number one, don't judge my motives, okay? I'm not doing this, quote unquote, for the approval of the world. It's nothing but headaches. I don't function in contexts where there's any benefit to talking about this. I'm a conservative evangelical churchman.
I don't want to be too critical of his um how he's going about this video, but some of this stuff does seem like it could go into a different video, him sort of addressing potential critics of, because it's like we're Adam and Eve historical people. It's like that's what I'm here for. And now I'm listening to him kind of go on about like potential criticisms and how different people in the church operate. I feel like that belongs in a different video. But here we are.
Most of the people who watch my videos are more on the conservative side, and they watch it because I like defend Protestantism and stuff. So I get attacked a lot for this kind of thing. There's no benefits from that. My motive, so honestly, so far as I know my own heart, my motive is the truth. Okay, I am for people to wrestle with because it's so important. All right, third and final section of the video. Let's say you're open to that and you're saying, okay, so what are the options? How could we do that? What might it look like? Well, let me survey three options. First, what I call the ancient Adam model. Second, a recent Adam.
Though I do appreciate he put a jumping ahead point. It's almost like he he rightly predicted that some people might be like, okay, we're here for the we're Adam and Eve historical people portion. So I appreciate that little point he put in the video.
Model, and third, a genealogical Adam model. Okay, I'm not advocating for one of these versus the others, and those are not the only models. I just want to describe them, give some pros and cons for each, and you'll see each has some challenges. And I'm going to leave aside here like the notion of a group fall, like C.S. Lewis's view in The Problem of Pain. That's not going to come in here at all. So first, ancient Adam is basically, a lot of people think that Adam lived a long time ago. So you have like some proposals of like a Neolithic Adam and Eve, or a more recent Adam and Eve, who are more sort of archetypal human beings. Maybe they lived 10,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago. But a lot of others think Adam and Eve were a lot older. And there's part of the concern here is you want to be able to have Adam and Eve as the biological progenitors of all human beings. And so some people, you can find people who will put, Adam and Eve back around 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago. I think the more recent models of the Ministry of Reasons to Believe, it's a wonderful ministry that does a lot of work in these areas. They do a lot of great evangelism and other things as well, other topics. I think they're probably somewhere in this ballpark, Others go even further. You can even find proposals like the anonymous scientist in this book, for example, puts Adam, it considers this proposal pushing Adam way back to the start of the Homo genus. So this would be almost 2 million years ago. Probably the most famous example of this in more recent times would be William Lane Craig. In this book, which I have interviewed him about on my channel, and you can check out that. I'll put up a thumbnail of that video. Shouldn't be hard to find. And this is a really important work in this area. He basically goes through, he has two sections. First, he goes through Genesis 1 through 11, and he argues the genre of this is mytho-history. People routinely misunderstand that as though he's calling it just myth. Okay, myth and mytho-history are two different things. You can disagree with it, but it's not myth, okay? He's saying it is historical in its interest. And then he's arguing from the New Testament that basically, based upon what Paul says and what Jesus says, you need a historical Adam. So he's trying to defend a fairly conservative view. And so he ends up putting Adam way back, maybe 750,000 years ago or even older. And so that, and he thinks of Adam as possibly a member of the species Homo heidelbergensis, which is one of the hominin species. And he reflects upon this theologically, very careful and interesting and useful and important book. I'm not inclined to agree with his specific proposal, but it's a really important book in this area. What are the pros and cons of this? If you have an ancient Adam like this, the obvious benefit of this model is you are protecting the unity of humankind more clearly. The further back you place Adam and Eve and the fall, the smaller the human population is and the more geographically contained the human population is. So it's easier to explain how Adam's sin and other aspects of human uniqueness spread to all humanity. And that's somewhat dependent of course, on how you play out the details, of course. There are some challenges for this view as well. 3 that I see. First, if you have an ancient Adam view, typically that requires an African location for Adam and Eve before the emigration of Homo sapiens to other continents. But a lot of the
I'm guessing by ancient he means 100, 200,000 years old or further back. I mean, ancient could also mean Neolithic. But I do believe he's talking about the 100 to 200K. Yeah, let's go.
Features in Genesis 2 to 4 look like they're talking about the Near East. You've got references to the Garden of Eden as in the East in Genesis 2:8. You have the Tigris and Euphrates rivers identified. And you have a lot of things that look more in the Neolithic ballpark, like maybe 10 or 20,000 years ago at most. You've got farming in Genesis 4:12. You've got precious metals like gold and onyx in Genesis 2:11 through 12, and bronze and iron in Genesis 4:22. You've got musical instruments like the lyre and the pipe in Genesis 4:21. So all of this, it's like, okay, maybe that's way further back in Africa, but it looks more recent in the Middle East. Second, it's widely acknowledged that biblical genealogies can have gaps. So you can't use genealogies for exact dating, but it's tough to see the genealogies can stretch out this far, as certainly some of these proposals require. You end up with having genealogies that would be equivalent to, like us today saying Julius Caesar begot Charlemagne, who begot Neil Armstrong. You're skipping vast passages of time. That seems difficult. Third, if you have an older Adam, you have the struggle of these interbreeding events between Homo sapiens and the other hominin species, especially Neanderthals and Denisovans. And so basically what the science looks like is that you have interbreeding between these different species. So we all have a Neanderthal DNA in us, for example. And those interbreeding events go up to maybe like 30,000 years ago. So this is going to create some problems because now you've got basically sinful, image-bearing descendants of Adam potentially interbreeding with non-human beings. Or if you say those other hominin species are also human, you have to explain that. And that you could have a scenario in which Adam's descendants split into different species. Okay, now there's responses to that, but I'm just flagging that's a.
Let me say, the fact that I no longer believe in the historical accuracy of the Adam and Eve, what I would consider a myth. I feel for him trying to justify the potential historical reality of an Adam and Eve person as history. It's a tall task. It's not easy. But hence why I'm watching to sort of hear somebody do attempt to give it a fair shake and a fair attempt. Because it's not something that I'm trying to prove or uphold, but I'm open to how would somebody, especially today, make a case for this? So that's hence why we're watching this, is sort of like, I don't want to well, this person has a different point of view than me, then therefore it's not helpful. It's like, no, it's good to listen to people who I'd probably disagree with him on many of these things, but it's good to sort of hear him out.
The challenge you got to work through. Okay, what about a recent Adam view? A lot of people go this route, and they say, okay, look, Adam's not the biological progenitor of all modern human beings. He's more for this archetypal human. Like people, you think of the founding fathers of our nation. Okay, Adam and Eve are our parents in this more representative or federal sense. John Stott, evangelical Anglican leader, he's a good example of this position. And I'll put up this quote. You can see basically he was very comfortable with trying to harmonize these harmonization efforts between Adam and Eve and evolution. And in his book, Understanding the Bible, he went a little further. He said basically, some forms of the theory of evolution don't necessarily contradict Genesis. And the real problem is this alternative between the two. A lot of times these terms, of course, are not defined very carefully. But a lot of times there's a perceived tension there, and that's the real problem. And with respect to Adam and Eve, what he basically says, he coined the famous term homo divinus. And he basically says, my acceptance of Adam and Eve as historical is not incompatible with my belief that several forms of pre-Adamic hominid seem to have existed for thousands of years previously. And he talks about this a little further. You can read this quote, and he talks about Adam being the first homo divinus, the first man who's made in the image of God, and so with Eve as well. Stott may have been influenced by his fellow Anglican Derek Kidner, who he's of evangelical. He wrote wonderful biblical commentaries, and Tim Keller has talked about this proposal of his, that basically Adam is a kind of refurbished hominin, and then Eve is a de novo creation from Adam. So this is kind of a intermediate view. And the motivation for this is basically to not simply accommodate to the evolutionary science, but also to make sense of the biblical data. Because I'll put up Tim Keller's quote here, but basically it would explain some of these questions about Genesis 4. Another option here is Dennis Alexander. If you read this book, this older book, He goes through like 5 different models. On page 289, option C is this model. He goes through that. So there's lots of others. John Walton's work on this might fall into this space, maybe. So what are the pros and cons of this? Obviously, the downs. Somebody might say, by the way, well, obviously you have to have Adam and Eve as the bio. I mean, Eve is called the mother of all the living in Genesis 3:20. But on the other hand, again, we have to be so careful. In Genesis 4, you have Jabal as the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, and Jubal, his brother, is the father of those who play the lyre and the pipe. That doesn't, when it says they're the father of those who do that, that doesn't necessarily seem to mean biological. It does seem possible that you've got Adam and Eve as functioning more in this kind of archetypal or federal way. However, there's some real challenges for this view. Okay, I'm not trying to say this is right. I'm trying to flag it, say this is an option people like John Stott have proposed, but it's got pros and cons. And one of the challenges, you have to find a way to account for the transmission of human uniqueness all over the globe. Because basically what most people think is that human beings had emigrated to Australia maybe 50,000 years ago, to the American continents already 10 to 20,000 years ago. Sometimes that's put earlier. So you've got to find a way to say, how do you have the transmission of human uniqueness to everybody else? And ultimately, it's hard to retain that.
Gotta be honest, after listening to an hour and 4 minutes of this, I have not been, the most I've been moved is just to potentially consider that there's like the longest shot that again, that these people, that Adam and Eve existed in some capacity, but not as like, I wouldn't even think that they are created by directly from the creator of the universe, but in a way like maybe by a figure who considered himself God. And I would consider that to be the longest shot possibility. I just listening to him trying to go through all these hoops and everything just in a way kind of reconfirms on my end that this is indeed should be treated as a creation myth. And to go beyond that, I think I would consider it a little reckless in a way. Just due to how much evidence and proof support the contrary to this being real, actual people who actually, that Adam and Eve lived at some point, or that this story is talking about those people, even if God at some point had some way or decided to intervene to say create even if it was like the first hominids or the first Homo sapiens or what have you. The story of Adam and Eve is not about those creations.
You have to go more to like what Dennis Alexander proposes as the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which it doesn't cause human rights, it's recognizing that, and some people want to see Genesis 2-3 like this. That's a steep price to pay. So you have to be aware that it's a con for that position. A third option is the genealogical Adam view. This book is a couple years old now, got a lot of press when it came out. Josh Swamidas wrote this book, and fascinating book. So he's basically arguing that the traditional account of human history from the Bible is true, and that's totally compatible with evolution. And to get this, he distinguishes between a genealogical Adam and genealogical ancestors and genetic ancestors. So a genetic ancestor is someone from whom you get your DNA. A genealogical ancestor is someone whose lineage we descend from. And he's saying you could take the story of Genesis totally as literally as you can imagine it, okay? Adam's made from the dust. And then as human beings then spread out from the garden and marry other people who are outside the garden, then human uniqueness spreads like this, and you could have universal Adam and Eve can be it can explain the genetic challenge without any problem at all. It's an interesting book. Let me read from one of the endorsements on the back cover. Quote, I am one of the many scientists who have maintained that the existence of Adam and Eve as ancestors of all people on Earth is incompatible with the scientific data. In this book, Josh Swami Das effectively demonstrates that people like me, stuck in a specific genetic paradigm, were wrong. The existence of two individuals, ancestors of us all, is now freed from what seemed like the scientific inconsistency and placed once again purely into the realm of theology where it belongs. That's from Daryl Falk at Point Loma. So obviously that view has some strengths. One of the challenges is the weirdness of this way of spreading human uniqueness out through intermarriage. And, you know, the first question that immediately comes up is, was Cain's wife made in the image of God? And that's, this is still, you're not just getting the traditional model. You're getting a change of its own kind, of a different kind, and that has some peculiar aspects that you'd have to then try to explain. So I'm not trying to say that's a problem that couldn't be overcome, but that's one of the things you need to be aware of. So what do you make of all this? I'm just trying to canvass some options. So these are 3 proposals that have been put out there for how to put this all together. I probably incline a little more towards the second of those 2, the recent, but I recognize it's got challenges. I can't answer all the questions. I think one rational approach to this is simply to be careful and simply say, we don't know yet, and just refrain from taking a hard position. And basically to be able to say, we don't know exactly how to put all the pieces together, but we think there is a way to do it. And here's a way you could think of it.
Yeah, I think that's you know, to go back to me saying that it's kind of reckless to believe full-heartedly in, you know, that this is talking about something factual. You know, to sort of be careful and say and being open to potential different ways that this could be true is probably the safest and most sane position for somebody who wants to support the idea that this is, you know, based on some kind of historical factualness.
It's not necessarily irrational to maintain 2 different beliefs and just be uncertain how to harmonize them yet. But you know they can be harmonized in different ways, but you're just not sure how to put all the pieces together. In fact, I think almost all of us are going to be in a situation like that. As the conclusion here, let me return to this idea that Genesis 2-3 is a gift to us. I find Derek Kidner very helpful on this. He says the accounts of the world of science and scripture are as distinct and each as legitimate as an artist's portrait and an anatomist's diagram, of which no composite picture will be satisfactory, for their common ground is only in the total reality to which they both attend. Scripture's bold selectiveness, like that of a great painting, is its power. I love that phrase. Scripture's bold selectiveness. That's what Genesis 2-3 is. It's hard to harmonize Genesis 2-3 and science because they're different. You know, it's like trying to harmonize a painting that's true.
I mean, it's hard to harmonize. It's like saying it's hard to prove because the evidence over many decades, the evidence is becoming far greater against Adam and Eve happening. If it wasn't for that darn evidence, it's becoming harder to harmonize. Son of a gun. But you know, it's unfortunate for those that you know. Again, it would have been simpler if all the evidence kind of pointed to Adam and Eve. Would have been far more simple and convenient. So far less complex history compared to what we actually have with Denisovans and Neanderthals and what have you. So, such is life. The more we understand, it's like the more complex life seems to actually be.
True and historical and a diagram. You know, they're functioning differently. But that's the great power of Genesis 2-3. The power of the painting is it's telling you something you could never learn elsewhere. It's telling you who you really are. You are completely different from the animal kingdom. You are made in the image of God. And you have a soul. You are morally accountable to God. and we inherit this status of alienation from God, which means we need reconciliation to God, which he has provided through Jesus Christ. That's the core. That's the core of it all. And I'm urging for patience in how we then understand all of that. All right, let me give some book recommendations.
It is sort of interesting how if you take out, I mean, just calling Adam and Eve, like if somebody accepts that Adam and Eve is a creation myth, that doesn't take away what Jesus did on the cross. It doesn't. But there does seem to be, I'm not saying that he's saying that, only that it's like this little, like, threading in there that it does, or for certain Christians, it would feel like it would when it's not. It just, what Jesus did for humanity does not require Adam and Eve to be true, in my opinion.
To finish, partly because my camera's going to die soon, and partly because it's late. But there's a lot more here. Is there anything else I want to say at the end here? I guess I could sum up by saying I think we need a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall. I think we should be patient in trying to understand.
We need. See, it's such an odd word. We need. I don't think you need it, buddy. I don't think Christianity needs a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall. The issue is that it would be extremely inconvenient for Christianity if it became the dominant viewpoint that Adam and Eve is merely a creation myth, because then a lot more work would have to be done to kind of rearrange the pieces, or at least just not put as much stock on Adam and Eve, because it is used as almost a motif in certain key moments throughout the Bible. So it'd be very inconvenient, but Christianity doesn't need it to function in some kind of like, Christianity doesn't fall apart if Adam and Eve is a creation myth.
Understand how that fits with the current scientific claims. There's a number of models on the table, and it's okay to not be sure which one is correct. That's kind of what I'm arguing in this video. I know that will make some people angry, but I'm doing this because I think a lot of people are so in anxiety about this. We just got to talk about this. We have to be able to talk this through, like I'm doing in this video, just trying to lay it out there, because it causes people to walk away from Christianity wholesale, and I don't think we want that. A couple books to recommend. Alvin Plantinga, Where the Conflict Really Lies. Amazing book. I love his writing too. The first sentence, let me open this up. This isn't a couple years old. First sentence of the book says this: my overall claim in this book, there is a superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion, but superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism. And I think he makes that case powerfully. Fantastic book. I've recommended Jack Collins' book, Reading Genesis Well, before, but he's also got a book on Adam and Eve specifically. Did Adam and Eve really exist? Who they were and why you should care? He defends the historicity of Adam and Eve, but he's careful in how he works that through. If you want a great book on the doctrine of creation in general, Matthew Levering's book came out with Baker Academic a couple years ago. Amazing book. And he's got a chapter in here on Adam and Eve. Matthew Levering is a brilliant Roman Catholic theologian, one of my favorite theologians alive today. And he's got, let's see here, I think it's chapter 6 or chapter 5, I can't remember, where he goes through Adam and Eve. And he talks about, he's very conservative in his instincts, but he's showing patience for how to put all the pieces together. And it's another great treatment of this. All right, let me know what you think in the comments. I'm sure there'll be some negative reactions, but I'm doing this because I think we have to talk about this, and I think some people really need to know there's some options to work through here. And, consider what Augustine had to say, and I think that gives us some space to say, we shouldn't be so quick to assume we know exactly how to interpret these ancient texts. Sometimes, like I said, I've been studying this for decades now. Honestly, I have some more questions now than I had at the beginning, because these issues are complicated. They're not simple. If nothing else, let's try to show love to each other along the way as we talk to each other. And for non-Christian viewers, I want to say, this need not be a barrier for you. If you believe in evolution, this need not be a barrier. Start with the claims of Christ. That's the core of Christianity. And then, can you see how Genesis 2-3, if it's true, is offering, like Kidner suggested, this window into the deepest questions about who we are? I think the story of Genesis 2, think about it like this. If you don't have this story, the trouble you get into in terms of just trying to explain these things that we all sense are true, like the significance of the moral realm, the significance of human dignity.
Wait, the trouble? Huh.
So forth. It's hard to ground those if you don't have the painting. All right, so that I don't ramble, I will end it there. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Look, as somebody who grew up as a Christian pastor's kid, I find that was actually a lot more healthy for me to leave behind the Adam and Eve, like treating it as fact. So I have a opposite experience to what he is predicting that I would, if I had to guess. Which is, it is what it is. I mean, that's his prediction. He's not, you know, that's what he thinks would occur. It would, that those without the Adam and Eve stories being treated as some kind of factual narrative in some kind of historical way, you know, that maybe leaves open to something that would cause trouble. He didn't really go into detail on what that actually means or what that would look like. So who knows? I don't want to put too many words in his mouth. All right, what to do next? We got about 25 minutes left before I got to go. What is interesting, but I feel like a lot of that was almost felt like him preaching to the choir, but also like him like sparring with his contemporaries on the subject as well. More so than it was like him giving a more straightforward answer. I mean, he did along the way, just for an hour plus video, it did feel a little like, okay, can we let's go. Let's move along. Hmm. Did I finish this? I can't remember. Abraham, biblical archaeology. I think I did, yeah. Yeah, this is the one I watched the other day. Hmm. All right. Takeaways from that video. Um, it is interesting that like he did mention something that I thought was interesting was Genesis 2 through 4 can be considered like one block. Like it's different from chapter 1 and it differs from chapter 5 and that's something that I can consider as well. Because I mean, the whole point of this is for me to eventually do my evaluation on the book of Genesis, which I did just finish reading a couple days ago and taking notes on it. So I try to. What's unfortunate is there's several instances of in some of these videos that I've watched where they go over something called the Mari text, but whenever I try to look it up, like, oh, what are the Mari text? And there's just not really much that people have done, whether it be through Google trying to find something specific on those texts or what have you, or even a video that just covers it, because apparently, I, I don't know. I don't know. All right, what's the next thing to cover today? Hmm. Yeah, the other difficult thing is whenever I'm looking for oftentimes just information on the book of Genesis, a lot of videos I run across are more focused on like the Torah, like the first 5 books as a whole. And then it's like, okay, some of this information is relevant, but 4/5 of it is something that isn't relevant yet because after I do my evaluation on the book of Genesis, then I'm going to move on to Exodus and go through, step by step, book by book in the Bible. I don't know. Let's just see what happens when we do this. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, sort of like we're going to run into just like general overviews, which I just read the book of Genesis, so that's not really all that helpful. Was Noah's flood local? I didn't. necessarily mind his. It just seemed like a lot of meandering, which, you know, I do that as well. So, hmm. Mm, hmm. I think I might cut today short just because with 20 minutes left, I don't have anything really. I don't know if I want to get started on anything because I might want to watch. I didn't. We did get some information from, what I mean, from that video. So I wouldn't necessarily mind going through what he thinks of the Noah's flood. Ooh, John B. Peterson, way back in the day, 8 years ago, man. There was a time when I appreciated his work. Probably still sub to that channel. Well, now. All right, y'all. I think this is where I'm gonna leave it for today. And I'll pick this back up tomorrow, noon time CST. So, hope everybody has a good day. Catch you guys later.